Okay. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Allison Marks, and I'm Head of Communications and External Relations at the SDSN. Thank you so much for joining us for the first session of SDSN's new webinar series, Global Governance for Peace and the SDGs. Today's session is on the geopolitics of war and peace, and we'll discuss the recent crises that are rapidly reshaping the geopolitical order. Clearly, a very timely discussion for today. We have an incredible lineup of speakers joining us alongside SDSN President Professor Jeffrey Sachs, His Excellency Mr. Miguel Angel Moratinos, the Undersecretary General, High Representative for the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, and the United Nations Special Envoy to Combat Islamophobia. Her Excellency, Miss Maria Fernanda Espinosa, President of the Cities Alliance and Executive Director of Global Women Leaders for Change and Inclusion, and His Excellency, Mr. Vuk Jeremic, President of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Number one, we'll be recording this webinar. Number two, we'll have time for some questions toward the end, so please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and we'll try, of course, to get to as many of them as possible. Now, without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Jeffrey Sachs, President of the SDSN, who will be moderating the webinar and setting the scene for the discussion today. So over to you, Jeff.
Allison, thank you very much, and greetings to everybody joining today. I see that we have more than 500 participants online, and the numbers are rising. I wonder, Allison, can people enter where they're coming from on the chat, because it would be nice to have a collection of knowing where people are viewing from all over the world. So if it's possible for people to add their names, greetings, and location, I would be grateful. We're meeting in the next few weeks in a special webinar series because the world's in a mess. And the purpose of SDSN from the start 14 years ago is that our member institutions around the world and the individuals who are involved, students and faculty, researchers, scholars, scientists, engineers, should be doing whatever we can to help keep the world out of the ditch, out of a mess. And yet the dangers are rising quite significantly. The UN is under attack, and the UN goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, are under attack. They're actually under attack by none other than the United States itself, the country that hosts the UN headquarters, and that I think it's fair to say was the founder of the United Nations back in 1945. The United States doesn't pay its dues, is creating a deliberate financial crisis of the UN, with Secretary General himself saying last week that the UN might have to shut its doors if it can't pay its salaries, if it can't pay its bills. The United States walked out of 31 UN agencies and organizations just a few weeks ago. It's left the World Health Organization, it's left UNESCO, it's left the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it's left the Paris Climate Agreement. It has repudiated the Sustainable Development Goals. It's quite a list, actually, and it's quite an assault. Trump's Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, mocked the idea of international law as mere niceties. It's power that counts. President Trump himself said that he's not constrained by anything other than his own mind. This is really something because anybody who believes they have no constraints is living in a delusional world and is actually a danger to others and to himself or herself. So this is rather stunning. And the fact of the matter is that it's not only an assault that we're seeing on the UN institutions, on the UN budget, on the UN goals, but of course, we're also seeing an assault on the UN Charter. The UN Charter was put into global law in 1945. It was ratified by the US Senate itself in July 1945, which under the US Constitution makes the UN Charter the law of the land of the United States, because under our Constitution, treaties that are duly ratified by the US Senate become ruling law in the United States, even though they are treaties, not laws promulgated originally by Congress. They still have the effect of being the rule of law. At the center of the UN Charter is the idea of preventing war by making it illegal for any country to use force or the threat of force against another sovereign country. This is the absolute core of the UN system and the UN Charter. It's Article 2, Section 4. People can find it online. But it prohibits explicitly the use of force or the threat of force by any country against any other member state. I'll read you the exact statement under Chapter 1 of the UN Charter, called Purposes and Principles. It says, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Now, obviously, we are not living in a world in which that is being honored, because daily the President of the United States personally is Iran, threatening Iran with a military attack, noting that there is a large armada just outside the waters of Iran, and that armada is ready to strike. I could read one of his posts. A massive armada is heading to Iran. It is moving quickly with great power, enthusiasm, and purpose. It is a larger fleet headed by the great aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln than that sent to Venezuela. Like Venezuela, it is ready, willing, and able to rapidly fulfill its mission with speed and violence if necessary. Hopefully, Iran will quickly come to the table and negotiate a fair and equitable deal. No nuclear weapons. One that is good for all parties. Time is running out. It is truly of the essence. As I told Iran once before, make a deal. They didn't, and there was Operation Midnight Hammer. That was the US attack last June. The next attack will be far worse. Don't make that happen again. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. That is a threat. It's not subtle. It's absolutely a direct threat of the use of force. It's in direct and stark violation of the UN Charter. It references another recent occasion, Venezuela, when the United States kidnapped the president of the country, exfiltrated him to New York City, to my city, where he is being held in custody right now, and where the U.S. maintains a naval quarantine, which is an act of war around Venezuela to this moment. So that was an actual use of force. None of these was restrained in practice by the UN Security Council, by the organ of the UN that is commanded under the UN Charter to have the responsibility of keeping the peace. In fact, it's quite alarming. Very few countries stick their neck out right now, even as these very stark threats are being made. There is a uh, a free rider problem, as we call it, which is that perhaps each country would like the United States to be told, don't do that. But no individual country or leader wants to be the one to make that, because that just leads to Trump's retribution against that particular country. This, by the way, is why we have a United Nations, so that these issues are not bilateralized, but are multilateralized, so that there is collective security, not individual security. But that system is basically breaking down before our eyes. And I find it absolutely alarming that it is, and absolutely of fundamental significance. I can add that indeed it's not only threats against Iran and other countries, but war in a variety of ways already underway. The United States bombed Iran last June. The United States and Israel together conspired to assassinate many of the leaders of Iran and many of the top scientists of Iran, which they did last summer. And then in my neck of the woods, economics, the United States has been engaged in economic warfare against Iran. And I want to point this out as well, because in an interview that our Treasury Secretary gave on January 20th to Fox Business News, the Treasury Secretary, Mr. Bessent, was asked about sanctions being imposed on Iran. And he says, President Trump ordered the Treasury and our OFAC division, that means Office of Foreign Asset Control, to put maximum pressure on Iran. And it's worked, because in December, their economy collapsed. We saw a major bank go under. The central bank has started to print money. There is dollar shortage. They are not able to get imports. And this is why the people took to the street. So this is economic statecraft. No shots fired, and things are moving in a very positive way here. This is the statement by the Treasury Secretary. I'd like to unpack that for a moment. It says that Trump ordered maximum pressure on the Iranian economy, and it worked, because in December the economy collapsed. So when you read in the newspapers that the economy collapsed because of Iranian mismanagement or corruption, this is false. The economy collapsed because the United States used its economic instruments, mainly blocking payments to Iran for oil that Iran was exporting, and thereby depriving Iran of foreign exchange, which is needed to import food and medicine and other basic needs. So this was a deliberate act of economic warfare. And Bessent says it. They were not able to get imports, and this is why people took to the street. I don't know about you, but I read the New York Times every day in the last 3 weeks, and they never told me that. They only told me that people took to the streets to oppose their brutal regime. They never once reported what Mr. Bessent said openly and publicly. That's also part of the information war that is underway, which is that the mainstream media report a narrative, not the actual news. Bessent calls this economic statecraft. I call it economic warfare. He says that when people come out on the streets and there's mass unrest, things are moving in a very positive way. I call that a very negative way. This is the difference. One can have the view that the United States can do what it wants to bring down another country's government and economy, or take the view, which I subscribe to, which is that the UN Charter is there precisely so that no country can attack another country in this way, and that the reason for the UN Charter is that if we have a world of war of all against all, if we have what's sometimes called a Hobbesian world of anarchy, where there is no law, there are no principles, there's only power, the kind of world that was described by Trump and his deputy chief of staff, that is a world in which we are all endangered. So let me come to the final point about our endangerment. Supposedly, actions like this, unilateral actions by the world's most powerful country, are supposed to make America safer, whatever it does to the rest of the world. But this is not the case. Just last week, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists issued its annual report on the doomsday clock. The doomsday clock is the graphic used by these atomic scientists to help the world understand how close we are to nuclear war. And what has happened in the last 35 years since the end of the Soviet Union in December 1991, and what was then called the unipolar moment when the United States thought that it could do what it wants in the world, that world has made the US and the rest of the world less safe year by year, less safe to the point of bringing us to the brink of World War III. Last week, when the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists unveiled the doomsday clock, they pushed the hand of the doomsday clock towards midnight, which means towards nuclear Armageddon, by another 4 seconds, saying that we are just 85 seconds away from midnight. This is, of course, a metaphor. But in 1991, the clock was at 17 minutes away from midnight. Then came NATO enlargement, the attack of the United States on Afghanistan and Iraq, the US attempt to overthrow the Syrian government, the NATO bombing of Libya, the Maidan coup, so many things, the war in Ukraine. And year by year, the clock has moved closer and closer and closer to midnight, meaning that we're ever closer to disaster. Now, less than a minute and a half away from Armageddon by this metaphorical clock. This is real. We're in extreme danger. We're not being made safer by departing from the UN Charter. We are being made far, far more insecure. We are all far more endangered than in the past, even in the recent past. Finally, our mission as UN, Sustainable Development Solutions Network, is to promote the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals were adopted in 2015 as a shared vision of the world's leaders for the future that we want, a future that's peaceful, prosperous, fair, environmentally sustainable, and cooperative. Those were the goals that were set. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals embody that vision of a shared, prosperous future. They are based on peace. They are based on global cooperation. Indeed, SDG 16 explicitly is for peaceful societies. SDG 17 is explicitly for global cooperation and partnerships. So this topic today, the topic of the geopolitics of war and peace, is not incidental to our mission of sustainable development. It's absolutely central to it. Unless we have peace, we can never achieve climate safety, economic prosperity, social justice. We may not even survive as a species. And so the issue of war and peace is absolutely the fundamental issue on which everything else of human concern depends. That's why I'm so grateful for all of us to be together to discuss these issues. And I'm profoundly grateful that we have a panel of the most distinguished statesmen of our time, people who have led the United Nations, who are leading the United Nations, and who know right from wrong. And so we're going to start with our panel now. I think that Undersecretary Miguel Angel Moratinos is not yet with us. He's probably held back in a meeting. So I'm going to turn first for our panel discussion to Maria Fernanda Espinosa, who has been a global statesperson, a global leader for sustainable development. She was introduced as president of the Cities Alliance and executive director of Global Women Leaders for Change and Inclusion. She has been president of the General Assembly. She's seen it all in action. And so, Maria Fernanda, if I may turn it over to you, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation, and to you, Jeff, and to SDSN, as always, touching the very hot topics of the day. And I heard attentively to what you say. And what is obvious is that we are witnessing not simply the breakdown of the post-Cold War order, but something perhaps more paradoxical. We are living a world of high multipolarity, but combined with a dangerously low multilateralism. So the diversity of power centers has expanded, and yet I would say that our collective capacity to channel that diversity into more cooperation and solutions has diminished. That is a very big picture, what you painted, Jeff. And let's look at a few numbers that I have here. 240,000 people died in conflicts in 2025 alone. So 240,000 people in conflicts, more than 117 million forcibly displaced, which means that 1 in every 67 human beings are being displaced because of conflict. So this is not just a crisis of the world order. I would say that is an ethical crisis. It is a crisis of our shared humanity. And perhaps if you allow me very quickly, what are the trends that I see? The first would be something that I call the fortress temptation. How is that you face fear, and when you feel your security is at risk from all fronts, not only security in terms of war, but also in terms of your financial and your energy, your food security, your need to access some critical minerals. So I would say that that economic integration has become weaponized. You mentioned that. What we see is that nations are building self-reliance in energy, in food, in critical minerals. So in that impulse is understandable, no? But a world of fortresses will be, as you also mentioned, poorer, more fragile, more prone to conflict. The second trend that I see is that the very character of conflict has transformed. We see civilian casualties among women and children. They have multiplied by 4 in the last 2 years. So conflict-related sexual violence has surged in 87%. And at the same time, we see the use of artificial intelligence connected to surveillance, to autonomous weapons, to algorithmic targeting system threatening to accelerate civilian harm. So it's not only about this war among military people, it's wars affecting and hurting citizens around the world. So we see in my region, for example, the mounting of transnational organized crime, which is it's really dismantling democracies and economies in Latin America and the Caribbean. In all of these, I have to say, it's not collateral damage. I think it represents a fundamental shift in how wars are fought, with civilian populations increasingly targeted rather than protected. And the third issue that perhaps I can mention is the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, and the climate and conflict nexus. So I see that we are experiencing environmental and security crises in ways that previous generations didn't face. We see 90 million displaced people now living in countries with high exposure to climate hazards, natural resources extraction, most of it under illegal economies, for example, illegal mining, illegal logging in the Amazon region, that is unfortunately become the rule of the game. And this is driving violence as armed groups compete for increasingly scarce resources. So we are entering an era where climate shocks and armed violence amplify each other in devastating feedback loop. So in what is true at the same time, we're seeing the multiplication and expansion of conflict, more and more civilian casualties, more sexual-based violence for women and girls, but we see less cooperation. And we know that no country can address these risks alone. So the question I would pose, and perhaps for further discussion in the panel, is that the question isn't whether the old order is dying. I think that there is no doubt that it is. The question is whether we have the courage to build what comes next in terms of the institutional designs, in terms of the new comparative advantages of the UN. This is a moment demanding the political imagination to design new institutions, new arrangements fit for our interdependent reality. And the truth is that the UN continues to be indispensable. The UN continues to be the only universal platform we have. So perhaps we can discuss what is that the UN can do more and better, because we have to acknowledge that most of the conflicts, what we see, at least the ones that are in the New York Times that you read every day, we see Ukraine and we see the Middle East and Gaza, we see Iran, but there are almost 60 ongoing armed conflicts in the world of today. Where is the UN? What is the UN doing? What are the capacities that the UN has? You mentioned a financial crisis of the UN. I would argue the financial crisis is a symptom of a deeper legitimacy and political crisis of the organization. So in this panel, we sit here as UN defenders, as people that care about the UN, but the UN has to be retooled, reimagined, redesigned. Look at the comparative advantages in the peace and security field. That is among one of the key challenges of the organization. And to be frank, the issue of peacekeeping, for example, the role of regions, the role of sub-regions. I mean, we need to think differently. And of course, we cannot be moved by fear. The truth is, yes, we are very close to a nuclear catastrophe. What is that we are doing? We are very close to having the next non-proliferation treaty conference of the parties. What is that we expect the world to do under the existing legal frameworks that we have? So the situation is bleak, but I think that we should not lose hope in the capacity of the UN to reinvent itself. Thank you, and over, Jeff, and perhaps we can discuss these issues afterwards.
Wonderful, Maria Fernanda. Thank you very much. you've put on the table a lot of questions that we will be discussing, especially the new UN and how it needs to be saved and how it can be saved and what it should be doing. You mentioned, of course, the nuclear threat, and I did as well with the doomsday clock. But we should also note that this week, if nothing changes, and nothing is likely to change, the last remaining plank of nuclear arms control between Russia and the United States is likely to end, the New START treaty. There will be no nuclear arms control framework between the United States and Russia, each with 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons, and the United States and Russia and China building a larger nuclear force now, unconstrained, it seems, by any arms control framework. So the question is absolutely urgent. I don't know whether Miguel is there, and
Think not yet, so I
not
think we
yet.
can move over to
Okay, good,
Mr.
great.
German.
So we will
I'm sorry.
oh,
I'm sorry, Jeff. This is Nihalsa, director of UNOC. You know, Mr. Moratinos was here in the building since almost 10 minutes to 9.
yeah,
And they are trying, he's stuck in an elevator in the between the third and the fourth floor. And we have all the team, technical team of engineers are trying to fix the problem. He's still there. And I will not tell you how he is right now.
yes,
Yeah.
not
So
happy.
not happy at all. So I think that it's a matter of time and he will be able to join this meeting, but he's definitely missing an amazing and very inspiring conversation here.
Well, thank you. And oh my God, this is, they turned off the lights and they're turning off the elevators too, I'm afraid. So this is something not very good. We wish him
Thank you.
quick extrication and to be with us. And in the meantime, we will move to His Excellency Vuk Jeremic, who is the president of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development, CIRSD, in Belgrade. And he also is a former president of the General Assembly. He led the negotiations that culminated in the Sustainable Development Goals, and he has been foreign minister of Serbia as well, so profoundly experienced. And Vuk, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for this truly kind introduction. And good morning or good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be a part of this panel. It's obviously great timing to discuss this important issue. And I know that Jeff mentions the doomsday clock quite often. I do look up the doomsday clock very often myself. And what I noticed is that if you look at the moves of that clock, the readings, if you want to try like plot it on a graph, you realize that the moves are quite cyclical. It goes up and it goes down, and then you try and figure out what was actually beneath these moves. What I'm currently teaching my students in Paris, I am a professor of international governance and diplomacy at the Paris School of International Affairs, is that the geopolitics is a cyclical matter. Cyclical in a way similar to economy, in a way that the good periods are followed by bad periods. And the main difference between geopolitical cycles and economic cycles is that geopolitical cycles tend to be much longer than the economic cycles. They are less well defined. In economics, you know exactly what is a recession. It's very well understood, it's quantified. It comes every few years. It lasts for a few years. In geopolitics, the cycles are longer. Look at the reading, look at the graph, if you will, of the doomsday clock. And what we're currently living in, and what Jeff described very, very eloquently, the snapshot in time, which we're currently going through, is a very, very deep trough of a geopolitical recession. We are in a recession, geopolitically speaking, right now. We are at the lowest reading of the clock for good 40 years. I think that the last time we experienced a geopolitical recession of this severity was actually late 70s and early 80s. By the way, the doomsday clock at the lowest reading back in the 1980s was showing 3 minutes. So we are in a worse situation than we were in mid-80s. It was prior to Gorbachev. It was a moment when Olympic Games were boycotted. Ronald Reagan became president of the United States by promising that he was going to destroy the evil empire. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. There was a revolution in Iran, and so many other things were happening at that time. For those who have been around, watching tentatively what is happening in the world, what has been happening in the world, I think it is no secret to say that this is the lowest point since 1984. The lowest point is definitely on the doomsday clock. But if you also look into what is going on in the world, it is going to be very obvious, and Maria Fernanda also described it very beautifully. Now, my question is, what do you do? I mean, how do you get out of geopolitical recessions? The most terrible stage of a geopolitical recession is a geopolitical depression, again, to use the economic terms. Geopolitical depression is actually a world war. Usually, humanity kind of gets it together after a big catastrophe like of that size, and the United Nations were formed in the aftermath of the biggest calamity in human history, which was the Second World War. This time around, I don't think this is an option, that there is a global war between the major powers, and then only after that war, people are going to come to their senses. The technology that we have today would probably make that conflict the very last conflict in human history. So the question is, how do you actually come out of a recession short of, war between the big powers? And I'd love to, I'm hoping, and I'd like to think that the way to get there is through stabilizing of a new system. And a new system is definitely going to be some sort of a multipolar order. The unipolar order that came very forcefully into existence with the implosion of the Soviet Union in 1991, it has come to an end, and we can argue what are the main reasons why it has come to an end so quickly, why it has not been the American century like many people heralded, and how many poles we are going to have in this new order, or whether or not one can call it an order. These are questions to be discussed separately. But I'd like to think that the alternative to war exists, and that it's going to be the equilibrization, stabilization of a multipolar equilibrium, in which obviously the United States is going to be an important pole, because despite the fact that it is no longer alone at the global stage of power, if you will, it is still the most powerful country in the world, obviously with the biggest destructive potential. Nobody doubts that, and Jeff was reflecting on it quite eloquently. But there are going to be other poles. China is a pole. Russia proved to be a pole. There is a pole that is rising and strengthening, which is India. And I also believe that there is going to be a pole in Europe, in the European continent. It's going to take some political locomotions and developments in the European continent in the next few years. But I think that if I were to make a projection or a prediction, that there is going to be a pole in Europe that it will be important and significant in this, global setup. Now, in order for a multi-body system to be in equilibrium, there are going to be a lot of tweakings and pushes and goodwill and well-meant work in order for this to be placed in the equilibrium. And there is going to be a constant danger of things exploding. You know this from the three-body problem. For those who have read the three-body problem Chinese novel or watched the Netflix series, this is going to be a many-body problem, more than three, and therefore very, very unstable inherently. Now, what do you do and how do you help assure that there is a stability in the end of the day? Maybe it's going to take 5, maybe it's going to take 10 years, and not the explosion of the system. I believe that there are 3 things that one could and try to do in the meantime. One is to reform the multilateral institutions that we have, and to be very honest and realistic, one should not expect quick solutions, quick, systemic, long-lasting solutions in this regard. The second thing you can do under the circumstances is to engage in international cooperation at sub-global levels. So to engage more in regional organizations, to basically find alternative fora for cooperation if the multilateral organizations are not delivering everything that you need. These are the 2 good things that one can do. There is a third thing that one can do, although I'm not sure if it's a good thing. Actually, I am sure that it's a really bad thing, is to take matters into your own hands and do things unilaterally, do what you must and don't care what others say. And I am afraid that on top of the first 2 things that I mentioned, the coming years are going to bring more attempts at unilaterally resolving matters. First and foremost by the United States. And even this year, I mean, Jeff started off by explaining the situation with regard to Iran. I fear that there is going to be action in this context. And I also fear that before the end of the year, there may be further action in the Western Hemisphere. And that what happened in Venezuela is not the last demonstration of the so-called Danro doctrine, and that action might be taking place elsewhere in Latin America, and in particular in the Gulf of Mexico. And I mean, of course, Cuba. Having in mind the American domestic political cycle, having in mind the main actors around Trump, I fear that we'll be seeing that. I'll stop there, and then I'll answer questions if necessary.
Of course, it will be necessary. Thank you very much for very wise words. Let me just riff a moment on the analogy of geopolitical cycles and economic cycles. You said a number of very important things. One is that we do move between periods of relative peace and cooperation and periods of conflict, and that these are long waves. And I think that there's a lot of merit in drawing that out. In Europe, you could do that systematically after the French Revolution in 1789. There was a period of generalized war, of course, led by the French Revolutionary Army and Napoleon's attempts to dominate the continent. And that war basically continued roughly from 1792 to 1815. After that came what was called the Concert of Europe, where after exhausting wars over a generation, the 6 major powers of Europe said, we will cooperate and collaborate to prevent another outbreak of generalized war. And this concert of Europe uh, succeeded in a lot of ways in stabilizing Europe during the 19th century. Not entirely, of course. There was the Crimean War between France and Britain against Russia in 1853. There were the wars of German unification, which created the German state. There were the wars of Italian unification, but there wasn't a generalized war in Europe during the 19th century. Europe took its wars abroad by imperializing Africa and Asia, but did not fight a general war inside Europe. This broke down, of course, in 1914 with the World War I, which was a cataclysm that remains with us today. After World War I, there was an attempt to return to a concert of Europe, as it were, by establishing a new League of Nations, which was the UN of its day. And that also gave rise to even treaties to end war, the Kellogg-Briand Treaty of 1928. So there was a moment where the idea was we can solve this, we can get on top of it. Of course, it collapsed. It collapsed in the 1930s in the combination of economic collapse and geopolitical collapse with the rise of Hitler, and World War II ensued. The United Nations was the successor organization of the League of Nations. And the idea of the UN was we'll do better than the League of Nations. It's a very big question, very fascinating question, actually, to go back to the history, the founding history and ideas of the UN, which emerged mainly in the United States and in diplomacy between the US, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom. These were the three main founders of the UN system. But the idea, definitely, that Franklin Roosevelt had about the UN was that it would be a global institution to keep the peace that would be based on cooperation between the major powers. So the idea of the Security Council and the veto, for example, which now so frustrates any action, is that the veto wouldn't really be used because the great powers would cooperate with each other. And had Roosevelt lived to see the UN into operation, I think it might have been different because he was a political genius and he was able to cooperate with Joseph Stalin. So the United States and Soviet Union actually might have avoided a Cold War had Roosevelt lived. But he died just weeks before the UN Charter was adopted. He died in April 1945, and his successor was not able to cooperate and not interested very much in cooperating with the Soviet Union, and the Cold War emerged. So the UN, from the beginning, was frustrated because of the US-Soviet divide. When the Soviet Union ended in 1991, we might have thought that we would go into a geopolitical boom, to use Vuk's idea, because the Soviet Union and then its successor state, Russia, was saying, we don't want competition anymore. We actually want partnership, peace, rebuilding after the misadventure of state socialism. We actually want to make a normal economy and we want to have normal relations. This did not happen, actually. It was in 1991, at that moment, that the doomsday clock was the farthest from midnight, 17 minutes away. But every US action afterwards, in my view, led us closer to midnight, not farther away, because the US didn't quite want peace. It wanted hegemony. It wanted unipolarity. It wanted dominance. And so that is quite an ambition, rather arrogant one, in my view, and a dangerous one. But instead of making a mutually respectful peace with Russia, the United States gave orders to Russia. You do this, you do that, we expand NATO, we do what we want, and you obey. And this ultimately led to the explosion that is today's Ukraine war, in fact. So I think, Vuk, you're absolutely right that these are cycles. And it raises a question because economics, my field, has studied cycles for a long time. And up until 1930s, we took the cycles more or less as acts of nature. These are things that happened. You could study them, but you didn't do anything about them. And then in the 1930s, one particular charismatic and brilliant economist, John Maynard Keynes, said that we can do better than just living with these cycles. We can stabilize the system. And so he actually invented a macroeconomics of stabilization. And we even gave it the name of this economist. It was called Keynesianism. And the idea was if you're in a cycle, you can use monetary and fiscal policy to stabilize the cycle before it collapses. One of the things that economists came to understand, not very clearly, but they did come to understand, is that cycles can lead to tipping points that then lead to absolutely disastrous outcomes. So a contraction, an economic recession, can lead, like you said, to a depression under certain circumstances. And by all means, you must avoid the depression. So in the 1930s, we didn't avoid the depression. The result was mass unemployment, the Great Depression, and also Hitlerism, the political response to it. In geopolitics, you mentioned it, the equivalent of a depression is war, outright war. And the consequences of that are also cataclysmic. So the question is, can we have a macroeconomics of geopolitics, a macro, not economics, but a macro geopolitics, which which enables stabilization? What would it be? How can it be achieved? How can we avoid conflict? One thing that I've noticed is that these episodes of war and peace to their participants seem almost self-fulfilling. If you're in an era of peace, anyone that threatens the peace is ostracized. If you're in a period of war, anyone that talks about peace seems like a fool. And so these seem like self-consistent systems, very hard to get out of. If you talk about the UN today, you're considered a naive dreamer. Don't you understand power? If you had talked about power in this way 50 years ago, you would have been considered a Nazi, sorry to say it. It would have been considered completely outrageous to talk the open way of the use of force that people talk about today. So there's a sense in which there's an internal dynamic which needs to be understood and overcome. Both of you talked about reform of the UN as being essential, and I absolutely agree with that. And the odd part is the country that gave birth to the UN and that hosts it is the least enthusiastic about it right now, the most antagonistic. If you look at the public discourse, the US openly mocks the UN and threatens to leave it, while China and Russia openly praise the UN and claim that they want to defend it. So this is quite interesting. I think it's also generally the case that smaller countries rather desperately would like something like the UN, but many of them are just terrified by the United States and the threats that it poses. Or even if they're not terrified, they like the US pressure because they think they can swing the US to help them against their own local enemies. So they see this very instrumentally. So I think the questions for us are the following. First, could we conceivably return to great power cooperation, which was the original idea of Roosevelt? It died with Roosevelt himself on April 12th, 1945. But he was masterful at dealing with Stalin. And Stalin, who was no pushover, no easy person by any means, actually respected Roosevelt to the point where he sought cooperation with Roosevelt. So there really was, in my view, great power cooperation. Churchill was not as good at it, by the way. Churchill was more overtly anti-Soviet. If it were up to Churchill, the world would have divided, and it did divide afterwards. Churchill was the one that gave the speech about the Iron Curtain falling across Europe. But could there be great power cooperation again? If so, I'm hoping, for example, that Russia, President Putin might say to President Trump, you know, bombing Iran is probably not such a good idea, Donald. It's not such a good idea for you. It's not so smart. It could really go terribly the wrong way. So great power cooperation, to my mind, is not out of the question. Reform of the UN itself so that it actually functions properly is also crucial. Just a word about this, and now I see that Miguel is with us, so I'm going to be short. But the budget that we're talking about in crisis is so tiny, so absurd, that obviously the issue of the UN budget is merely a game. It's a cover about power, not really about money. The core UN budget is $3.5 billion. That's rounding error for Elon Musk himself. When Trump says he wants $1 billion from each member of his new board of peace, you could raise $3.5 billion in about 3 phone calls if you wanted it. You could raise the whole UN budget in a call to Saudi Arabia, and a call to China, and a call to the Emirates, and a call to a few countries. No one's picking up the phone because this budget issue is really just a disguise for the more real issue of who supports the UN as an institution, not the money involved. But the money turns out to be very important if you want to stop malaria, or if you want to control climate change, or if you want to do other things. So the money's not incidental, except it became part of a game of the great power politics. The regional cooperation, let's come back to that. The role of the BRICS, let's take that up as well. But without further ado, I'm delighted to see Undersecretary General Miguel Moratinos out of the elevator into your chair. Thank you for being with us, and we're thrilled that you can jump in on the conversation now. Over to you.
So thank you, Jeff. Well, you know, it's a very extraordinary experience. It's the first time I'm stuck 50 minutes, practically 1 hour. It's very strange feeling, you know, you cannot do anything. So anything. I know we are running out of time. So thank you for convening this.
Lots of time for you,
Okay.
Miguel.
So I saw also my friend, Maria Fernanda in book. I missed their intervention and your intervention. So I'm jumping into my own reflections directly, very quickly. I will express, I think everybody have shared this concern about the whole situation is today. Secretary General, in his first address to the member state, the first speech in the General Assembly to the new year, he said, he acknowledged that we are in a chaotic situation, a world chaotic, and so everybody agreed. And I think we all knew, and all the three, you, Maya Fernanda book, in the previous year, we were saying, already sending alarm clock that the situation need a reform, radical reform, updating and changing, adapting the new challenge of today's world. But people didn't want to listen, and the reform and the proposal were, from my point of view, too late and too little. And at that time, well, the concern is that today we are in a big chaotic, we don't know. People seem lost. People has a lot of, question mark about their future, about their own future, and the future of their nation, the future of humanity. And that is my concern. The analysis is that what we were already addressing in the past year, has become a reality in 2025. 2025 has been, from my point of view, one of the most horrific year in relation with humanity. And I will say why. It's not only the proliferation of conflict, crisis, wars, the death of so many people, the suffering, the destruction, but what I think even more concern for all of us is the loss of, the human attitude, the human behavior. We have witnessed during this awful year how the situation was deteriorating, how we became totally dehumanized, how the human beings have get through homeopathic, doses in the screens, how people are killed, how are suffering, how they bomb a hospital, a school, and then, well, we didn't do anything, or we didn't succeed to stop all this nonsense. And so humanity is coming to a position quite similar after what happened after the Second World War. You also, Jeff, have said that maybe we are in a situation similar or what happened with the League of Nations. I don't think it's the case, because I think I'm still convinced that the UN should survive and should overcome this crisis of today. But in the substance, is quite similar. And it's quite similar because in 1945, we succeed to put into the new world that this cry of never again. And this never again was not only reflected in the preamble, and I think we have to extract the lesson of 1945. I think I have three main elements. The first one is this preamble of the prophecy of Isaiah, we have to try to avoid and to prevent humankind of this scourge of war. The second prophecy was, the second element important is, I think, the element that in the preamble they say, we the people of the nation. We didn't say the government. We say we the people. So the people are the ones who have to lead any process. And thirdly, as you mentioned in another occasion, they agreed to have this collective security system. The security of everybody counts. Any security arrangement have to take into account the security of the other part, and that has totally blown up in 2025. We don't have a collective security system. We don't prevent a new generation of the scores of war, and we are the people with nations that have the responsibility to take action in this moment. So at that time, the multilateral system worked, I think, correctly in a bipolar world, because it was convenient for the two bipolars, by the Soviet and the United States. Then it continued to work quietly well under unipolar world with the United States. But now we are on a multipolar world, and people, they don't want anymore to have bipolarity or unipolarity. They want to have multipolarity. So we have to enter multipolarity in the multilateral system, and that is the challenge. How we are going to establish a new UN, updated UN, where multipolar poles are respected and working together. So just not to prolong my intervention, I have three proposals to share with you. One is a level of states. Of course, they are still important actors. We have to count on nation state, governments. I think we have to mobilize as we could call a new coalition for multilateralism, what we could call a group of friends of multilateral, a new multilateralism for the 21st century. I remember that some of us were being considered appeasement when we asked in the Ukrainian war to talk and negotiate with President Putin and the Russian Federation. You couldn't talk because we were implementing what this dirty word appeasement. If you talk, if you negotiate, you are appeasement with the Russian. Well, I didn't hear anybody today that the Europeans and others had been also implementing this so-called appeasement because, you don't confront, you don't stand up strongly against one actor that want to impose themselves, they want to invade, they can bomb, they can use, violate international law, and you don't do no. No, we have to appease, we have to see, we have to engage, we have to see, we have to be moderate. So that is a kind of strange appeasement. So in front of appeasement, let's go and establish a group of countries that should lead, this new group of friends that want to set multilateralism. And I fully agree with you. I just heard your last comment. It's not a question of financial crisis. Of course, it's a financial crisis, very serious. But it's a question of power. Who want the world we want for the future? And that, I think, we need a kind of champions. We cannot ask the P5 to reform. It has to be done by others, by the BRICS, by the Europeans that have to wake up and have, by the African, by the Asian, a group of 180, 90, 100 countries that say we want a new multilateral system that introduce and respect the new multipolarity. And that has to be done as soon as possible. And then that it was at the level of national state or government. But I think what is more important, but we know how difficult our today's political leadership are reacting to the whole situation. And is that what I said, the global citizenship, what we are doing in the SDSN, this fantastic network that you have established. I think people have to resist and have to express to their government that we cannot continue. There is a large majority of people. I saw in my activities at the UN Alliance of Civilization, as we saw in Riyadh in last forum, and we saw in Sevilla, the civil society, they want a better world, and they're ready to mobilize for that. So we have to really mobilize the citizens of the world in a campaign to save the UN, to save the multilateral system, the new multilateral system. And I think some ideas can be done, even for the financial crisis. I think, first we have to make a call to the European Union. Imagine we are in favor of spending 900 billion euros for rearmament, but we are not ready to put a single euro to save the UN. How is possible? How is possible that Europeans that are so-called in favor of multilateralism are not ready to make an extra effort? Instead of putting, 900 billions to rearmament, they could put 200 billions in favor of the UN. As you said, you can call the Gulf country, you can call many actors to save the financial crisis. But so we can have also, crowdfunding. I think you call each citizen in the world the people mobilized and said you can put $10 in order to save financially the UN, I think everybody will ready to put 10, 15, $1, $5 in order to save the UN. And that will make, the people reflect and the political leadership that they are other people. You have seen in the United States, here in New York, you see about the whole situation of immigrants in the United States. People are resisting. And I think that is what is my word. I said to my young colleagues and the students when I give some lecture, two words. First, to resist, and second, to be hopeful. Resistance and hope is the work we have to create together. So thank you.
Miguel, thank you. Those are wonderful ideas. I really like the idea of crowd financing, especially given the timing of a new UN Secretary General coming in. The world could provide some cushion for an incoming Secretary General to say, look, the world wants this, even if the governments are dragging their feet. And maybe they would be provoked to do something. So I like that. I think we will absolutely look seriously at how to promote that idea. It's an excellent one. What I would like to do is ask Vuk and Maria Fernanda to come in and make any further comments. And then I'd like Allison Marks to take one or two questions from the chat. So if you have a question, put it in the chat and we'll get those. And then Allison will tell us about the upcoming webinars that we'll be having, because this is the first of 4. And we absolutely are going to be taking up all of these questions quite seriously. What is the post-2030 agenda? What would it mean to revisit the UN Charter in a particular way? So these are absolutely the topics for further deliberation that we'll be having in the coming weeks. Let me say one more thing before turning it over to Vuk, if I might, and then Maria Fernanda. Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada gave the most riveting speech of recent weeks in Davos, where he said it absolutely clearly. The world order is ruptured. The middle countries need to stand up. Exactly what Miguel has just said, that the P5 won't do this on their own, but the dozens and dozens, indeed, it's 188 other countries that are P5 that can play this very, very important role. And Mark Carney showed us, not only by a wonderful speech, but actually by traveling to China and saying, I'm not going to succumb to bullying by our next door neighbor. We will make a partnership, even a strategic partnership with China on economic issues. And that shows that independence of thinking. So Vuk, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and hello, Miguel. It's very nice to see you. And I remember very fondly I worked together in various capacities in 2016, in particular, when both you and Jeff were exceptionally helpful and supportive when I ran for the post of the UN Secretary General. It was 10 years ago, but it was not during a geopolitical recession. So the world looked different and what we were proposing. I'm sure that both of you remember, Jeff and Miguel, were 53 concrete things, what we need to do with the UN to make it fit for purpose in the 21st century. I was actually looking at this document just before this webinar, and I realized that about 70% of those proposals that we put forward in 2016 that were tangible and imaginable, and that I would have actually, like I promised I'd do if I were elected Secretary General, are right now objectively off the table if you want to seriously consider what can be done under the circumstances. And whilst I very much hail and support Miguel's ideas, and whilst I'm joining Jeff in saying that I was deeply impressed by Mark Carney's speech in Davos, it really warmed my heart what he said. In reality, and we are in this many body problem reality, many bodies being the poles of the emerging multipolar world, I think that the biggest priority is to make sure that our multi-body system doesn't explode. So we no longer have a world to care about. And the three, I think, most crucial protagonists right now, as I said, there are more than three poles in this emerging multipolar world, but the three most pertinent ones are the US, Russia, and China. And the current dynamics in this three-body system is that Russia and China are growing closer and closer together, and that there is this antagonistic relationship with the United States. If this trend continues, I fear that the system is going to be out of balance. I fear that if what unfortunately most European leaders are currently advocating is the prolongation of this strategic trend in which US pole and Russia and China poles getting so close together that the system becomes unstable. And then you know what happens in a three-body system that gets off balance. I hope that the war in Ukraine, because of what I just said, I very much hope that the war in Ukraine is going to come to an end this year. Because if that happens, and it can only happen if there is an agreement between Russia and the United States, first and foremost, Russia and the United States. So Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, for those who like them or dislike them, I mean, I'm just trying to be brutally realistic. It is down to Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump to bring this conflict to an end in 2026 so that a dynamic in the multipolar system, let's say in the three-body system, becomes such that it is in the interest of Russia to make sure that the system is in balance. And then good things can come out of that. I think that the zeroth thing to be hoping for under the circumstances is peace in Ukraine. Otherwise, not only this three-body problem dynamic is going to continue going in a direction that is exceptionally dangerous, I fear that yet again, there can be a spark in the European continent that can bring the world into a war. Because if the current trajectories are kept, if the Europe keeps, arming itself, if the European Union keeps cutting off relations with Russia in a way that they can be not restored, even if there is a peace deal, then I fear that the dynamics in the continent are going to be such that once again, Europe can drag the world into a catastrophic conflict. And I fear that more, as a matter of fact, and maybe this is going to be controversial, what I say. I fear that more than Trump's adventures in 26 in the hemisphere or in the Middle East, because Trump is not going to start World War III by attacking someone who can respond in a way that brings the World War III into existence. He's going to be attacking weaker countries. He's going to be attacking weaker enemies. But Europeans, on the other hand, I fear what can come out of this Russia-Europe relationship if the war in Ukraine is not brought to an end in 2026. And let's face it, only Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin can do that in 2026.
Thank you, Vuk. Let me turn it to Maria Fernanda.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and hello, Miguel. Sorry, the accident you had this morning. So many good ideas. I've been taking profuse notes, I have to say. 3 comments. One is on the need for a new financing compact for the UN. Because the way it's working right now, it's really bringing constantly the UN to the limit. And it's not the current crisis, the recent crisis, because we see that there are 1.5 billion in arrears for the core budget of the UN. So it's not only one country not paying, several countries are not paying their dues because perhaps they don't see the value for money that they would like to see from the UN. Number two, we see, for example, 3.7 billion in arrears in the peacekeeping budget. So, in these very few weeks of the beginning of the humanitarian work in 2026, only 7% of the needs were covered by the current budget. So this is not an issue about money. We said that many times. It is an issue about a legitimacy crisis, a political crisis of the organization. So we need to redesign the finances of the UN. You are super bright minds, especially Jeff. I'm sure that you already have something in mind, the idea of crowdfunding, why not, but something that would keep the organization going regardless of any particular political crisis. So that's one challenge, of course, that we have. The second issue is that, and believe me, I've been around the UN. I've never worked for the UN, but I've been around the UN for about 30 years. And since day one, there were concerns about the financial health of the organization. Yep. An organization of $67 billion cannot rely on 80% of voluntary funding. It's very complicated. No, it's not only too little resources, but most of the funding comes from voluntary sources. So a new redesign of the finances of the organization. Number two, this coalition of the willing in defense of multilateralism. I would say, well, it's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea, but I think we should be very careful about coalitions that live outside very critical countries. Yes, Carney's speech was very good. Yes, we have a G77. Most of these countries, I'm sure, that are very reliant on a well-functioning multilateral system, but I think it has to be a large coalition. And that, of course, includes the United Nations, the United States. Why? Why? Because we haven't heard the US saying we don't want the UN. What we hear the US say is we want a better UN. We see a full deployment of people and a team in New York looking at the reform of the United Nations to have an organization that delivers better. We have seen a bipartisan conversation about putting money in the UN. We saw the contributions of the US to the IDA fund of the World Bank, for example. And if you look at the numbers, and here again, when Miguel said the citizens, no? The citizens should say and raise their voices. Here there are good news. If you look at the polls, at the global polls that, for example, Pew and Gallup do, you see that 61% of the people view positively the UN. If you look at the US only, 57% of adults in the UN think that the UN does well, and 60% in the US feel the UN is necessary. No? And basically, around the globe, and here I'm looking at the Edelman Trust Barometer, 75% of the people worldwide trust the UN. So these are numbers that give us hope, because perhaps the political elites, us included, are looking at the UN wanting to reshape the system to make it more fit for purpose, not only a new financing compact, but an overhaul in the peace and security architecture that looks more to the comparative advantages of the UN. For example, the issue of prevention. We are failing in preventing conflict, and we know that it's cheaper than responding to already existing conflicts. And we haven't done that enough. Some people think that preventing conflict is difficult. Good oversight is difficult, is difficult to communicate even, but I think that we have a big role to play there. And of course, the UN is with the peoples. These 75% of we the peoples thinking that the UN is needed, the UN is irreplaceable, and we need to think in a new UN 2.0 for the 21st century. So I'm not, I am an optimist here. In times of crisis are times of opportunity. I think that we have in our hands the opportunity for redesign. And of course, we are worried about what is happening in terms of the conflicts around the world. Of course, we need to act and operate on that, but I think that we need to listen carefully, not only to the majority, but also to the P5 to see and explore what is that they are expecting from the UN. What would be the best way to have value for money in investing in an organization that is delivering for all? So the challenges are huge. But I think that we all have a role to play. I count myself in the 75% of the world that believes the UN is irreplaceable. And we need to continue working, to continue having these conversations, these webinars. I think it's extremely helpful, not only for the analytics and the narratives, but also to come up with solutions and alternatives. Over, Jeff.
Thank you so much. Everybody has spoken brilliantly and eloquently. I'm grateful. We've reached the end of the time. We will take the chat that we have and collect the questions so that we can bring them to the fore at the next session. So don't despair. Just our timing was a little bit off because of all of the exigencies of the morning, including elevators and the rest. But there are excellent questions in the chat. You will find in the chat the schedule for the next 3 sessions. Let me just say on March 10, all of them are at 9 a.m. Eastern time. On March 10, we will have an hour and a half on how to accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals. On April 1, we will talk about the post-2030 agenda, which will be at the top of the agenda of development for the new Secretary General coming in at the start of 2028. And then in the 3rd session, on April 23rd, we'll talk about revisiting the UN Charter itself, fundamental reforms of the UN, so-called Article 109, which invites a charter review to update the charter after 80 years in our new multipolar world. What should be the key points? This is real. This is important. We started this with SDSN in a conference last September. We'll continue with that. We will make practical recommendations. And this is, I think, key for us at SDSN. What came out of this today was a lot of exciting ideas I want to take forward. The crowd financing, the crowdsourcing, I think is an excellent idea. Just to say, right now, the core budget of the UN, as I said, is $3.5 billion. That's 42 cents per person in the world. 42 cents. Imagine if we collected $10. That would be $81 billion. That would go for the core budget for the next decade so that nobody could threaten the lights going off or the salaries not being paid or anything else. And I think that this is actually very, very practical and achievable. I think we may want to think about communicating with the European leadership because there's also a sense here that Europe is the region that has so much at stake, so much history, and yet for a lot of reasons right now isn't where it needs to be as a world leader speaking about defending the UN and defending peace. And I think there's something very practical to be said here. So we've reached the end of the hour. We have had 600 plus participants all the way along, and at the start, almost 800 live. This will be posted. It will be viewed very widely. It will be shared through our networks. We will have tens of thousands of people viewing this. Please be sure to join us for the next session. Again, that will be March 10 at 9 a.m. And we'll see everybody there. And to our distinguished panel, all gratitude for your wisdom, and we continue.